Welcome to History Nest. Tonight begins a descent into a forgotten corridor of ancient power, sensuality, and silence. Let the sands cover you. Let the darkness breathe through you. This is part 1 of Wives of the Black Pharaoh. Sleep now, if you can. When the sky over Wazit darkened with ash, and the river Nile thickened with silence, a man rose from the obsidian crypts beneath the temple of Set. His name, once whispered only in heretical rites, was now carved into the skin of living men. Set, crowned in shadow and born of forbidden blood, took the throne not with triumph, but with ritual. He wore no golden mask. His regalia was simple: a black linen robe soaked in oils of cedar, frankincense, and the sap of blood figs. His skin was never seen beneath it. His eyes were lined with coal so thick it bled into his temples, trailing like tears hardened in the desert. His first command was not war. It was not tribute. It was the choosing of 7 wives. They were not taken from the houses of nobility, nor from the harem schools of Thebes. They were found in ruins, in temples long swallowed by sand, in crypts where women had been buried alive. The priests said they were chosen by omens, by the positions of stars that had no names. But servants whispered something else. They had never spoken a word. They were brought to the palace in silence, each cloaked in black gauze, their faces obscured, their hair matted with clay and spices. Their eyes, the only visible part, were wide, glassy, and vacant. Each moved like a shadow being dragged, not a woman walking. He named them not by name but by element: the sand, the smoke, the thorn, the mirror, the vulture, the silence, the vessel. One of them, they said, did not cast a reflection. They were given no chambers. Instead, they were sealed in the hall of consecrated flesh, a subterranean sanctum carved entirely from black basalt, polished so smooth it reflected movement like still water. The room had no torches, only oil lamps that burned with violet flame. The air was thick with myrrh, goat's blood, and something older, something that clung to the tongue. Each night, Set descended alone, and each night one of the 7 wives would be chosen. Her footsteps would echo for only a few seconds before silence devoured them. What occurred within the hall was unknown, but when the doors opened again, the air around the pharaoh pulsed with heat and rot, and his skin shimmered with something not entirely sweat. The wives never bore children. That was forbidden. Their flesh was sacred, not fertile. Their purpose was to absorb his desire, not prolong his bloodline. He believed their silence preserved his power, that in their stillness, his dominion echoed longer. They were not permitted to age. Every week, priests anointed them with oils boiled from crushed scarabs and embalming resins. Their skin glistened like lacquer. Their pupils, over time, began to dull. They did not blink. They did not sleep. Then one vanished. No scream, no sound, no sign. The vessel was gone. The others did not react. They simply stood in the hall, 5 in a circle, 1 in the center. The center always rotated, but that night no one entered the middle. 7 days passed. On the 8th, the walls of the hall began to weep. At first it was mistaken for oil seeping through the stone. But under flame, the trails shimmered with a greasy, iridescent sheen. Then came the handprints, thick, uneven, the size of a human palm, pressing out from inside the stone. They weren't carved. They pulsed, subtly, as if something beneath the rock exhaled. The palace trembled. Torches refused to stay lit. And in the southern tower, a scribe fell into a fit, screaming in all 7 voices of the wives. His tongue blackened and split. He died before he could be buried. Set began to forget words. At first, the names of his priests, then the names of the gods, then his own. He wandered the garden naked one evening, whispering in a voice layered with tones, some masculine, some not. He plucked beetles from the earth and swallowed them whole. His mouth leaked a dark mucus that burned the petals of the sacred lotus where it dripped. The remaining wives stood motionless in the hall, their eyes now fully glass, their skin pale with blue veins. They did not eat, they did not speak, and every seventh night the door opened by itself. There was no moon the night the hall breathed. It was not a movement that the eye could follow, not a gust or a quake. But the walls of black basalt within the palace of flesh began to throb with a subtle life, contracting and releasing as if stone remembered how to inhale. The servants who approached with bowls of resinous oil said they heard nothing, but their torches flickered without wind. Their skin broke out in sweat, though the hall remained cool as burial vaults. Something, they said later, felt awake. They did not linger. No one lingered anymore. The name of the Pharaoh, once spoken in daily chants and carved into the bones of animals for protection, was no longer uttered aloud. Hainferset had begun to decay, not in flesh, but in memory. His presence lingered, his body moved, but the syllables of his identity became brittle, hollowed by something that had rooted itself deeper than blood. Inside the palace, silence became so heavy it cracked the surface of bowls, tore scrolls along the fold lines, and made birds fall from the sky mid-flight when they crossed above the upper porticos. And in the hall of consecrated flesh, where the 6 wives remained, nothing moved. Yet the air felt choked with vibration. The first wife had vanished a cycle ago. She was not missed. Her absence left no mark on the other wives. They stood, still as lacquered statues, each pressed against the walls in identical positions. Arms at sides, chins lifted slightly, eyes unblinking. They were not women anymore, not fully. Whatever had once spoken through their mouths or fluttered beneath their skin had been replaced by something perfectly still. The priests whispered that they no longer needed food or touch, that they had become vessels not of the Pharaoh's desire, but of the thing that fed on it. Still, each night, the door to the hall opened, and the Pharaoh descended. No one saw him choose. No one heard his voice. But one of the wives would be taken into the far chamber behind the altar, and when the doors reopened at dawn, she would return, oil-slicked, trembling, but without sound, until the second wife vanished, too. It happened in stillness. There was no ceremony, no disappearance noticed in real time. One evening there were 6, and the next 5. The pattern had begun, but the stone remembered. That night, oily streaks appeared on the inner walls of the hall, not random but deliberate. The marks resembled long fingers, pressed with force from within the basalt, as if someone or something had pushed its hand outward from the other side of the stone. The priests attempted to clean the walls, but the marks would not fade. Instead, the oil seeped into their skin, leaving behind a sensation of cold sweetness and the taste of copper on the tongue. One priest claimed he heard whispering in his teeth for hours after touching the wall. He was later found in the scribe chamber, having carved the same symbol over and over into his arms. A jagged spiral, broken at one edge. They buried him with his hands bound in salt-drenched linen. Still, the symbol bled through. The wives did not move. The priests tried to discern patterns in their placement, in the shifting of their feet or the glisten of their skin, but every observation led only to contradiction. One wife appeared to weep a clear, sap-like liquid, but when touched, her face was dry. Another blinked, but only once and never again. Their beauty remained untarnished. Skin pale and smooth, lips full, eyes rimmed in charcoal. But something beneath that beauty had calcified, as if their bodies were now statues remembering how to pretend at being alive. One wife's mouth opened briefly during a storm. Her lips parted just wide enough to suggest a word, but no sound emerged. Only the scent of burned lotus and a heat that made the torch flames twist sideways in their sconces. The guards who witnessed it refused to re-enter the chamber. They left their posts in the night and were later found in the river, floating face up, mouths filled with sand. The pharaoh no longer spoke in public. He had taken to pacing the inner garden, naked beneath his ceremonial robe, which now hung from his shoulders like a molted skin. His body was lean, unwrinkled, but the hue of his flesh had changed. No longer bronze, it had turned a waxen gray, like the ash left from burned parchment. His eyes, once deep and rimmed with kohl, were now distant and often unfocused. He murmured constantly, not in Egyptian, not in any known tongue, but in a low droning rhythm that made birds flee and stone fracture. Those who heard it too long felt a tightness in their chests, as if their ribs had been pulled inward by unseen strings. One scribe tried to write down the sounds. The ink turned to dust on the page before the last syllable was finished. When he attempted to start again, his tongue blackened. He died without making a sound. And then the third wife vanished. No one opened the hall that day. No one dared. But when the next morning arrived, the bronze bolt that sealed the great door was open. Split not cleanly, but twisted, as though torn apart by pressure from inside. The priests entered together. Torches smoked heavily. The scent inside had shifted again. No longer sweet oil or incense, but something bitter and floral, like rotting lilies left in stagnant water. Only 4 wives stood in the chamber. The 5th, the one who had once wept, was gone. But her place had not been left empty. On the black stone where she once stood, a perfect ring of salt had appeared, unbroken, and within it, a single strip of linen stained dark, still wet to the touch. It pulsed with heat, though the chamber was cold. One priest tried to pick it up and screamed as blisters formed instantly on his hands. They left the strip where it was. By the next day, it had dissolved into the stone. The priests began burning older texts. Scrolls too ancient to be read aloud were unearthed, soaked in vinegar, and thrown into braziers. Rituals not used since the rule of the blind pharaoh were performed, with cracked bells and the blood of animals whose names had been struck from the living record. Still, the vanishings continued, and now not only the wives. The servants began to disappear next. Not many, but enough. A boy sent to clean the outer floor of the hall never returned. A water-bearer found his urn shattered beside the reflection pool and walked into the darkness without a sound. A girl who whispered in her sleep was found floating above her cot, eyes wide open, limbs limp, as if suspended by breath alone. Each night someone new was gone. Each morning the sun rose slower. One night, a storm passed over the palace without touching the earth. It came from the west, from the desert, where nothing had moved in centuries, and it brought no thunder, no wind, only pressure, the kind that made doors bend inward, that made statues weep black streaks from their eyes. The river, usually high from the flood season, receded that night. Fishermen found the banks dry and lined with small bones, not fish bones, but long, jointed fragments that resembled tiny human spines. That morning, the 4th wife vanished. Again, no sound, no motion, just absence. In her place was a stain, not oil, not blood, but something black and soft, like velvet left in water, could not be touched. Every hand that tried to lift it went numb at the wrist, and it grew, slowly, silently. By sundown, it covered a span the size of a sarcophagus. That night, Hainferset did not return to his quarters. His bed was untouched, but a trail of liquid slick, silver dark, and smelling of pine led from the edge of his canopy to the hall of consecrated flesh. The guards posted outside swore they never saw him pass. But when they opened the doors again, only 3 wives stood waiting. It was then that the people of Wazit began to turn away from the palace. For months they had left offerings at the temple steps: honey, feathers, cracked alabaster bowls filled with goat's milk and dates. Now they turned their backs as they walked past. The sacred path was no longer swept. The walls were no longer scrubbed with salt. And the name of Hainferset, once written on every lintel, began to fade. Not scraped, not washed away. The letters simply vanished, one by one, as though they had never been carved at all. Plague did not come. No famine struck. Instead, something worse. A perfect stillness began to take hold. The birds stopped flying. Crops neither grew nor died. They remained half-ripened, dry to the touch, as if the earth no longer remembered the end of a season. Children born during these months did not cry. Their eyes opened too early. Their tongues moved without sound. The midwives began burying them in jars, sealed with wax, in the fields beyond the city. The priests said nothing. The scribes no longer wrote. Only the hall remained unchanged. And yet, every night the door opened. The fifth wife did not vanish, not entirely. She split. One morning there were two of her, identical in form, identical in stillness. One stood where the fifth wife had always stood. The other was seated in the alcove behind the altar, head bowed, hands folded over her stomach. At first, the priests thought it an illusion, but the guards confirmed it. Two wives with the same face, the same dark eyes, the same lips sealed in eternal silence. But they breathed differently. One inhaled while the other exhaled, always out of rhythm, always inverse, a mirror but not a reflection. The priests did not enter that day. They burned incense from behind the threshold and threw chalk dust across the floor to mark any movement. The chalk never shifted. But that night, one of the guards was found hanging from the high cornice above the hall. His body folded backwards over the stone like a puppet without strings. His mouth was open wide. No tongue. Only a black ribbon of linen emerging from his throat. The ribbon was tied into 7 knots. The wives no longer blinked. Even those who had once closed their eyes between visits from the Pharaoh now stood with unbroken stare, their gaze fixed on nothing. They watched the empty air as if listening to something behind it. One began to hum, softly, barely audible, but the tone was so low it made the brass bowls in the adjacent chamber vibrate. The servants could no longer eat without vomiting. The kitchens remained stocked, but the food tasted of ash. Even the wine began to sour mid-pour, turning black in the goblets before lips could touch it. The scribes abandoned the main hall and began working underground, carving new texts not into papyrus but into the clay itself, pressing symbols into mud that dried too quickly, cracking along the edges like burned skin. The symbols resembled nothing known. Spirals, thorns, open mouths without teeth. Some had too many fingers, some none at all. They did not translate. They only multiplied. And then there were no wives. One night the hall was empty. No movement, no bodies, no breath. The basalt floor, always polished and warm, had cooled. The lamps refused to ignite. Even oil poured directly onto flame would hiss and snuff out, as if the very air no longer permitted fire. A silence took root in the space. Not absence of sound, but something thicker. A pressure that filled the lungs with weight, that made hearts beat slower, that made the mind forget names. The priests did not report the emptiness. They simply locked the doors and began fasting. Hainferset did not speak. His body, still young, still strong, no longer moved with the rhythm of men. His shoulders twitched in intervals. His eyes rolled behind his lids, as though tracking shapes on the ceiling that no one else could see. He began scratching words into his skin, not with ink, with nails. Each morning the healers cleaned the wounds, but each night new symbols appeared, always in rows, always symmetrical, One day across the chest, the next around the thighs. By the end of the month, every inch of flesh below his chin bore signs. They tried to cover them with linen. The linen burned. The hall of consecrated flesh remained locked for 33 nights. On the 34th, the door opened. No one touched it. No one stood near. But the bronze bolt snapped with a sound like bone under water, and the basalt swung outward, slow and deliberate. The air that emerged did not move. It hung in place like oil smoke, thick and faintly glowing, with a violet sheen that left trails in the eye for minutes afterward. The wives had returned, but they were no longer standing. They lay in a circle on the floor, bodies intertwined like roots, limbs tangled, faces turned toward the center, where no object stood, but the stone itself had darkened, cracked open in a star shape, and revealed something beneath the floor. Something not stone, something that pulsed. And in its pulse was rhythm, and in that rhythm breath. The priests did not speak of what they saw. They did not attempt to approach the wives. No rites were performed. No scrolls were read. They backed away from the hall in silence, their heads lowered, their footsteps cautious as if the air might shatter under weight. That night no torches were lit. No chants were whispered in the lower chambers. A silence not merely chosen, but demanded, settled across the palace. The servants avoided the western corridors. The birds, already rare, vanished completely. The lotus pools grew still and thick with black algae. The water would no longer reflect the sky. And beneath the foundation of the hall, the pulse grew stronger. At first, only the sensitive felt it, a rhythm in the soles of the feet, or a throb behind the teeth. But within days it was undeniable. The entire palace seemed to breathe with it. Every surface began to sweat. The sandstone walls dripped with condensation that smelled of myrrh and fermented milk. Curtains fluttered though no wind moved. One priest, driven by what he called the dream of the coil, entered the hall alone. He was never seen again, but 3 nights later, the walls of the inner courtyard bore a message. Not carved, not painted, grown, raised from the very stone in strands of glistening tendon-like fiber. The message was in no known language, yet every man who saw it understood. We are already inside. The 6th wife, the last to vanish before the return, did not stand in the circle. She hung, from the highest point of the hall, suspended not by rope or chain, but by strands of linen that emerged from her own body, wrapped and twisted like a cocoon of her own making. Her limbs were folded backwards, her mouth wide open, her eyes still fixed forward in perfect silence. A black liquid dripped from the tips of her fingers. It did not stain the stone. It vanished upon contact, but it left behind the smell of salt, blood, and something like wet feathers. The 7th wife was nowhere to be seen, but each night, something touched the door from within. Just once, a single knock, soft, measured, certain, and each time, it came not at the hour of prayers or midnight, but exactly when the breath of the Pharaoh caught in his throat, when his murmurs stopped for a single moment, as if responding to his silence. The high priest, oldest among them, who had not spoken in 40 seasons, gathered the remaining priests in the lower crypt. No torches, no lamps, only the fireless stones, the ones that glowed faintly when the name of the Black Pharaoh was pressed upon them. There, with dust thick upon their shoulders and insects moving freely across their robes, they performed one final rite, not to banish, not to cleanse, but to forget, a ritual of unremembering. They burned their names. They broke their teeth and placed them in urns. They sealed their scrolls not with wax, but with their own skin, flayed and dried into parchment. They removed every carving from their chamber walls, rubbed ash into their faces, and vowed never to speak the name of the Pharaoh again. Above them, the pulse stopped. For 7 days, the hall remained quiet. No movement, no scent, no sound. The air returned to stillness. The servants began to clean again. The lotus pools cleared. Even the birds returned, not many, but enough to draw hope from the youngest scribes who had known only the silence. For a moment the city exhaled, but on the 8th night the 7th wife returned. She did not enter the palace by gate or door. She rose from the river, naked, head shaven, eyes closed. The fishermen on the shore saw her first, pale and gleaming, as if covered in oil, rising not from the surface but through it, as if the water itself had delivered her upward. No ripples, no sound, only a scent. She floated toward the palace with arms crossed over her chest. Her mouth sealed shut with thread, black thread, knotted 3 times and tied into her own hair. Her feet did not touch the earth. Those who saw her fell to their knees, not from reverence, from sickness. They began to bleed from the ears and forget the names of their own children. One man tried to speak her name, though no one had ever known it, and his jaw snapped sideways as if pulled by invisible reins. She reached the gates just before dawn. The guards did not open them. They shattered. The gates, thick with bronze and obsidian, burst outward without force. Not broken, not bent, gone, as if they had never been cast. And behind her came not soldiers, nor wind, but scent, a flood of fragrance, honey, blood, iron, milk, burning feathers, crushed lilies, smoke from no fire, oil from no lamp, poured through the corridors. It soaked into the walls. It made men dream of things without form, and women weep for children not yet conceived. She entered the hall alone, and the doors, untouched by hand or rope, closed behind her. That morning the Pharaoh awoke with no eyes. The sockets were unbroken, the skin smooth, but the eyes themselves gone. Not removed, not missing, forgotten. He did not scream. He smiled. For the first time in 100 nights, he rose from his mat without aid, walked across the courtyard barefoot, climbed the stairs to the hall of consecrated flesh, and placed his hands upon the stone. The doors opened before he knocked. He stepped inside, and he did not return. No one entered after him. No one dared. But from within the hall came a sound. Not a voice, not a chant, not music, a wet sound, like breath trapped in a jar, like something pressing against flesh from the inside, like silk torn slowly underwater. And beneath it all, layered so deep it could not be heard, only felt, came the sound of 7 mouths opening at once. From that day on, the palace began to sink, not into the earth but into itself. Walls folded, windows darkened, light bent, stone forgot its shape. The gardens turned to dust, the fountains to bone, and at the center of it all, the hall pulsed. Now black as pitch, now silent as womb, now sacred as death. The name of the Pharaoh vanished from every monument. No one remembered his reign. No one remembered his wives. Only the scent remained, faint, cloying, unmistakable. When the moon went black and the river refused its tide, and those who walked near the old ruins, even centuries later, spoke of a pressure beneath the earth, a heartbeat, slower than any man's, older than any god's, still waiting, still watching, still choosing. The river no longer flowed in one direction. At first, it was a whisper, a shifting in the current that made the lotus flowers tilt against the sunrise, their pale blue heads turning not toward light but upstream, toward the black line of the horizon where water met heat-sick air. Then came the silt, thick and red, more like cloth than soil, swirling into the canals like blood unwilling to separate from flesh. No fish rose, no frogs sang. The water began to pull back toward the palace, slow at first, then faster, as though remembering something it had once been commanded to forget. Villagers woke to find their wells dry and their dreams full of ash. They spoke less. They locked their doors at dusk. They began to forget the names of their own mothers, their own gods. The river took the words first, soft ones, intimate ones, names whispered over infant cradles and deathbeds. Then it took the sharp words, the words for fire and hunger and need. No one remembered who built the palace. No one remembered the face of the Black Pharaoh. But every morning the river widened. It pressed closer to the palace walls, its surface black as ink, moving not like water but like something with a pulse. There was no longer a priesthood. The last rites had been burned in the cellar vaults and scattered into the sand in the 7th month of forgetting. Those who had once chanted now wandered the temple halls with blind eyes and sealed mouths, their tongues shriveled like figs left too long in the sun. The scribe stones, where names of kings had once been chiseled in proud rows, now bore only the shape of mouths, open, toothless, speaking nothing, carved over and over until the edges blurred into a scream. The young ones who remained in Wazit began to fear water. They walked wide around fountains. They buried amphorae instead of filling them. And yet, every 7th night, something rose from the river. Not a figure, but a scent, wet stone, old milk, the musk of something long buried and newly moving. It seeped through window slats and under doorways. It woke infants from sleep and made animals claw through walls to escape. The scent lingered in hair, beneath nails, inside nostrils. No washing could remove it. The wise began to smear themselves in ash, believing the thing from the river only remembered skin that was still warm. And in the palace, the doors to the hall of consecrated flesh remained shut, but the basalt behind them breathed like lungs pressed flat beneath water. Inside the hall, nothing decayed. The wives, if they were still wives, did not rot. They did not move. They lay arranged in a shape not made for human memory. A curve of limbs and chins and hips, a knot of eyes and long fingers that turned inward, always inward, toward a center no one dared describe. Oil pooled at their feet, thick and blue-black, the color of bruised glass. On the walls, handprints bloomed. 7 each day, rising higher, changing shape. Some became paws. Some grew claws. One widened into the outline of a jaw, gaping with a tongue long enough to touch the floor. No one entered. No one needed to. The wives were not waiting. They were remembering. And the more they remembered, the more the stone beneath them softened. It began to sag, pulsed underfoot, and sometimes, when the air was still, it could be heard moaning, very soft, very low, as if something beneath the basalt had begun to dream. The priests had once said that silence was the language of the gods. But the wives did not speak silence. They spoke absence. They spoke subtraction. They did not forget, they erased. Then came the child. No one knew where it had come from. It appeared at the temple gates during the dry moon, hair slick with oil, mouth shut by threads too fine to see. Its eyes were the color of old copper. It did not speak. It did not cry. But when it was carried to the edge of the river, the water stopped. Not just the current, but all sound. The reeds no longer swayed. The insects no longer chirred. Even the wind coiled away as if told it was no longer welcome. The child stepped into the river and did not sink. It walked across the surface, slow as incense smoke, feet leaving no ripple. And when it reached the other side, it turned once toward the palace and blinked. That blink cracked the palace gates. Not open, not broken, cracked. A single vertical fracture that bled light, not golden or white, but thick and red-blue like twilight dragged through wine. From that night on, the river became a circle. It surrounded the palace entirely, shifting its flow, bending the earth itself, so that every path to the Black Pharaoh's walls passed now through water that no longer behaved like water. Sometimes it rose in towers. Sometimes it parted like cloth. Sometimes it hissed when touched, turning reeds into bone and frogs into black stone. The child was never seen again, but in its absence something changed. The people stopped dying, but they stopped aging too. Time frayed. The sun rose later each day, but only by a fraction of a breath. The moon thinned to a thread and remained there, neither waxing nor waning, suspended in permanent hesitation. Women miscarried in silence. Men slept for days without dreaming. Crops neither withered nor ripened. They stood stiff in the fields like clay models of grain. The old ones said this was mercy. The river was holding time hostage, wrapping it around the palace, keeping the rest of the world at bay. But others said time was being eaten, that the wives, beneath the basalt, had begun to consume not years but memory. And without memory, there was no future. The scribes attempted to write new names, new stories, anything to tether themselves to a shape, a season, a sentence. But the ink bled. The papyrus grew brittle and fell to dust before the second line. One scribe began writing on his own skin, carving dates into his thighs, counting sunsets by wounds. But the wounds closed too quickly. His scars vanished. By the 7th week, he had forgotten why his hands shook. By the 8th, he forgot his name. He threw himself into the river, which welcomed him like a mother, and turned his body into silt before the bubbles could break the surface. No one entered the palace again. Not to pray, not to steal, not to learn. The doors had long since sealed themselves, fused by heat and time and something deeper. But still the pulse remained, still the scent, still the moan of the stone beneath the hall. And one day the wives began to rise, slowly, as if through water. Their limbs unfolded, not with grace but with inevitability, joints popping like knots pulled tight too long. Their eyes did not blink. Their skin was pale as candle wax, marked now with dark shapes, sigils that pulsed faintly with breathless life. They did not walk. They moved without steps, gliding across the basalt as though following threads tied to some hidden loom beneath the earth. They gathered in a ring. They looked upward. The ceiling above them split like old leather, and through the crack came not light but shadow. Thick and slow and hot, it spilled into the chamber like oil with memory. And the wives opened their mouths, not to speak, not to sing, but to drink. They drank the shadow in long, steady pulls, until their chests swelled and their limbs shuddered, until their bellies rounded and their veins blackened and their hair uncoiled down to the floor. They drank until the floor itself cracked and the pulse beneath it was no longer heard but felt, in the spine, in the teeth, in the dreams of every child born that century. The earth had never been quiet beneath the palace. Even before the first stone was placed, when the land was only dry scrub and thorn, the ground had groaned with things beneath it. Not creatures, not roots, but memory, something old and restless and circular. It was why the first architects drew their blueprints in spirals, why the columns curled instead of stood, why the throne was shaped like an open palm. They believed that to build upon forgetting was to awaken what remembered. And the wives, even in their stillness, remembered everything. When the sun passed directly overhead on the longest day of the solar calendar, the floor beneath the hall of consecrated flesh grew warm, not with heat, but with attention. Something was listening, something below, and the basalt softened in return, as if flesh responding to the breath of a lover. It was on that day, always that day, that the whispers rose again, not from mouths, but from the pores of the stone, rising like steam, curling around the statues, coiling through the hair of the still wives who did not breathe and yet heard. And what they heard was not language. It was pressure, need, promise. In that year, as the river looped twice around the palace and the moon failed to rise for 3 nights, the earth began to sink. Not crumble, sink, with purpose, with rhythm, as if the palace itself were being lowered into a cradle prepared long ago in dark beneath dark. Outside the palace, the city no longer made offerings. The altars were cold. The priests had turned to salt. Literally, their skin flaking into pale crystals, their eyes shattering like glass soaked too long in brine. No tombs were opened, no ancestors called. The people no longer died, but they no longer lived either. They ate little, they spoke even less. Their dreams came not in images but in tastes. Metal, ash, milk left out in the sun. They began to draw the same shape in the dirt without knowing why. a circle with 7 smaller circles along its edge, and a slit across the center. Some said it was a womb, others a mouth. A few believed it to be the eye of something older than the gods. But the most frightened, the ones who remembered what they weren't supposed to, whispered that it was a map, a symbol of what lay beneath the palace, not in foundation but in origin. Because the palace had not been built upon land. The land had been grown around it, and what grew beneath was not stone, not root, not clay, but flesh, not human, not divine, something for which the wives had been bred, not chosen, bred, like grain, like cattle, and now the flesh beneath the stone was waking. One wife, the second from the left, began to move her fingers, only slightly, only at night. At first the motion resembled a twitch, an echo of nerve. But with each night the pattern became clearer. She traced circles into the oil pooling beneath her. Circles with notches. Circles that connected. After the 7th night, another wife responded, this 1/3 from the right, by arching her neck so that her hair dragged through the oil, slicing lines through the circles. No one witnessed this, but the marks were left. They remained visible only under the scent of burnt myrrh and only when the river hissed against the palace walls. On the 9th night, the moaning of the basalt deepened, sounded no longer like pain, but like satisfaction, like something being fed. And in the city, a woman gave birth to a child with no mouth, no eyes, but the imprint of a crown pressed into the skin of its scalp. The midwives did not scream. They only bathed the child in sand and placed it before the temple steps. By morning it was gone, but in its place were bones, tiny, arranged in a ring, jawbones facing inward, and at the center, a single black tooth longer than a man's finger, warm to the touch and vibrating with a sound too low to be heard. Below the palace, the stone had begun to sweat. It wept oil not from seams but from symbols, those carved long ago, before language, before time. They pulsed now, and where they pulsed, the wives' bodies grew heavier, thick with something that was not blood, not water, something blue and slow. Their skin glistened, their breasts darkened, their bellies curved outward. But it was not pregnancy, it was absorption, inhalation. They drank the air of the chamber, the scent of shadow, the memory of gods long buried. And with each breath, the hall darkened, not from loss of light, but from gain of density. Even the torches, when relit, gave no illumination, only heat. The wives did not blink. They did not speak, but their bodies began to hum. Not aloud, but in the bones of anyone who entered. The guards stopped coming. The servants disappeared. Only one girl remained, a child left too long in the wrong corridor, who wandered into the hall with a clay jar of scented oil. She did not cry. She did not flee. She lay down between the wives and closed her eyes. When she was found, she was neither dead nor living. Her body was covered in writing, long, curling text in an alphabet unknown, scrolling over her limbs like vines. And in her mouth, there was a single sound, repeating, wet, thick, like a word being born underwater. The river, restless, climbed its banks, pulled itself into the streets, not as flood but as guest. It crept over thresholds, licked stairs, pooled beneath sleeping bodies. It made no noise, cast no reflection. When touched, it revealed memories the living did not own. Wars never fought, lovers never kissed, cities never named. And in each of these visions, the wives stood at the center, unmoving, watching, not cruelly, not kindly, but as witnesses, as record, as origin. Those who touched the river too often began to lose their edges. Their bodies blurred. They became smears in the air, impressions of warmth, scents of hair and breath. Eventually they vanished, not dead, not gone, just elsewhere, folded into the womb beneath the earth, into the thing that pulsed and softened and opened beneath the palace. And the wives, in their ring of stillness, began to lean inward, their spines bent, their mouths opened, not wide, just enough to taste, just enough to allow the next sound to rise, not a moan, not a whisper, but something deeper, a heartbeat, Slow, immense, final. Then the sky changed. For 3 days it did not turn. The stars remained in place. The wind reversed. The birds flew backward. The sun blinked, just once. And when it reopened its eye, the palace was gone. Not vanished, lowered. The earth had taken it in, not collapsed, not devoured, but embraced. The hall of consecrated flesh was now a navel, a scar, a knot in the flesh of the land. And the wives, now beneath all things, began their true work. Not birth, not ritual, but listening, listening to the thing beneath even them. The cradle, the mouth, the first memory. It was opening, slowly, like a flower of bone. And the wives, long trained, long emptied, long worshipped and forgotten, were not its guardians. They were its mirror, its muscle, its kiss. And as the stone darkened to blood and the river stilled and the air thickened with scent of milk and salt and iron, the first syllable of its name began to form, not in throat or tongue, but in marrow, in shadow, in the curve of the world's oldest silence. No one remembered the wedding. There had been no music, no ceremony, no crowd. There had been no groom and no bride, only a convergence of forms in a chamber that had no ceiling and no walls, only pressure. The hall of consecrated flesh, long since submerged beneath basalt and memory, had become something else. A mouth, yes, but also a bed. A chamber not of pleasure but of absorption. The wives no longer sat. They no longer waited. Their flesh, once cool and oiled, now pulsed with heat not of the sun, but of some internal ignition. The silence around them grew thick, not empty, but occupied by soundless motion, the churn of unseen limbs, the stretch of unseen mouths, the flicker of things not born yet already moving. And in the middle of this new density, the air itself began to tighten, contract, and finally yield. What emerged was not a husband, not a lover, but a presence that carried no shape of its own, only reflections of the wives. Each curve mirrored, each breath echoed, a joining without form, a wedding without name, and as their bodies arched toward it, their skin darkened to mirror the oil that fed the walls. They had waited not for a man, not for a god, but for this union with the unknowable, and it had come without a face. Above, in what remained of the surface world, the temple stones began to hum. Not resonate, but hum, a sound too low to vibrate the air, felt instead in blood and nail. Animals refused to enter the city. The birds flew in perfect spirals over the ruins, never landing, never stopping. The people who remained began to speak less and sleep more. And when they dreamed of weddings. Not joyous celebrations, but still rituals. Rooms where nothing moved except the air and the walls pulsed like flesh. In these dreams, they wore veils soaked in ash. They walked through corridors that twisted backwards. And always, at the end, they reached a doorway that bled. None dared speak of these dreams, but they changed. The villagers walked differently. They blinked less. They forgot their names. They began to mark their bodies with thin, black lines drawn in oil. The same oil that now bubbled up from beneath the palace ruins. Thick, dark, warm to the touch, with a scent not of decay but of recognition. Like breath held too long. Like silk soaked in blood. The wives had not spoken for centuries. Not even when they were taken, not when they were stripped, not when their wombs were sealed. Their silence had been ritual, obedience, design. But now it became language. Not words, not voice, but resonance. Their silence became the medium through which the presence moved. It did not command. It did not require. Simply was. And within that stillness, the wives began to move again. First together, then apart. Their limbs no longer human. Their hair moving like ink in water. Their hips and ribs pulsing with the rhythm of something deeper than heartbeat. They were not possessed. They were not transformed. They had been returned. To their purpose. To their function. They formed a circle not by intention but by instinct, their feet drawing symbols with each step. Not dances, not spells, but instructions, keys. Within that circle, the presence grew denser, more visible, though it never settled into one form. It flickered, male, female, beast, stone, shadow. At times it seemed to wear a crown of flame. At others it split into 7 tongues, each licking the floor. The wives did not flinch. They bent backward, their bodies forming arches of offering. And from between their teeth, something began to leak. Not sound, not blood, but memory, thick and dark and without source, pooling into the cracks of the stone and vanishing. Elsewhere, deep beneath the surface, far beyond the reach of torch or chant, the cradle stirred again. It did not awaken, for it had never slept, but it turned, slowly, like an eye opening in reverse. And when it moved, the world above shifted. Mountains cracked, rivers changed direction, trees bent until they kissed the soil. In temples far away, idols wept milk. In deserts never touched by rain, the ground bled. And in every corner of the land, women woke with wet thighs and the taste of stone in their mouths. The cradle, ancient and buried and infinite, recognized the marriage for what it was. Not a joining of bodies, but a merging of timelines. Folding, past into future, flesh into stone, silence into will. It had waited longer than any god. And now, through the bodies of 7 wives and 1 formless spouse, it opened again. Not to birth, not to destroy, but to absorb, because it remembered what others had chosen to forget. That kings are made of blood, but queens are made of earth. And the wives, now more than wives, began to sink deeper into the hall, the basalt swallowing them like water. The city ceased entirely. No more fires, no more speech. The few who remained gathered daily beneath the hollow where the palace once stood. They brought no offerings. They sang no hymns. They stood in silence, eyes fixed downward, waiting, not for return, not for sign, but for permission. They did not know from whom. They only knew that beneath the stone and oil and forgotten names, something had been joined. And in that joining, everything above had become less real, less solid. Shadows thickened. Time faltered. In the distance, thunder rolled without sky. And sometimes, in the moments between breath and thought, a figure could be seen standing in the hollow. A figure neither man nor woman, clothed in oil and bone, veiled in silence. It never moved. It never left. But it stood. And that was enough. Children began to be born with webbed fingers and teeth shaped like pyramids. Water refused to boil. Fires burned blue. But none of it was considered strange. The people had entered the long waiting. They understood that history no longer moved forward. It coiled now, spiraled inward toward the mouth of something that had no need of end. And in the deepest chamber, now almost entirely consumed by the cradle, the wives began their final gesture. One by one, they stepped into the presence. Not toward, into. Their bodies melted not with heat but with agreement. Flesh yielding to form yielding to concept. They disappeared, but not vanished. They joined, and as each was taken, the presence became more defined. Its limbs longer, its mouth wider, its breath thick with names that had never been spoken aloud. Not curses, not blessings, just names, long and wet and coiled like roots. When the 7th wife stepped forward, the walls of the chamber bloomed open. The basalt split, not violently, but like lips parting for a kiss. And through that new opening, darkness poured. Not absence of light, but presence of something else. Crawled over the stone, coated the walls. It reached upward, and the presence, now complete, stepped forward into that dark. It left no footprints, cast no shadow. It was the shadow, and behind it, a trail of memories, wives, and old gods unspoken stretched back into the core of the earth, where all marriages end. There was a time before time when mouths had not yet learned to speak, when they were only wounds in flesh, moist openings for air and hunger and salt. The first mouth had not been carved by teeth or shaped by tongue. It had been born into stone, a hollow so ancient and deep that its breath caused trees to rot from within and animals to forget how to move. This mouth existed before the Nile found its path, before gods learned their names, before the sky knew how to withhold rain. Beneath the palace of Hainferset, beneath the hall of consecrated flesh, and deeper still beneath the cradle, the mouth remained. Not sealed, not forgotten, only waiting. It did not open. It breathed, and its breath carried the dust of the first word, unsaid, but never lost. When the 7 wives disappeared into the presence, when their bodies dissolved into concept, that dust stirred. It rose in slow spirals through the stone, brushing against the black walls of the hall, crawling along the ancient marks that no longer resembled language. And when it reached the remains of the chamber, now hollowed like a womb, it paused, as if tasting, as if remembering. Then it moved again, toward the surface, not in a rush, but in a tide. A slow, deliberate release. The air thickened, the oil dried, and the dust began to whisper. The people above did not hear it with their ears. They felt it in their gums, in the softness behind their eyes, in the itch beneath their fingernails. It was not a sound but a presence, one that reminded them they were never meant to speak freely. Words became heavier, sentences withered mid-thought. Soon, only gestures remained. Hands pressed to lips, heads bowed, spines bent as if carrying the memory of a weight that had never truly left. Children were born with tongues too wide for their mouths. Old women began to cough stones. Men walked into the river and knelt until it swallowed them. The dust entered homes and did not leave. Coated food, skin, mirrors. Those who tried to clean it away found it only spread, like thought, like grief. The city, once proud in its ruin, became silent even in its collapse. No more mourning, no more rites, only stillness. And always, beneath that stillness, the dry whisper of the first mouth pushing upward, eager to reclaim the world it once held within its breathless throat. Far away, temples that had never known this pharaoh began to collapse. Scrolls blackened, statues cracked along their eyes. Priests bled from the nose while chanting names they did not understand. In distant valleys, black birds fell from the sky mid-flight. Their wings curled inward like hands in prayer. The dust did not travel. It did not spread. It remembered, and memory, older than fire, older than stone, moved not through space but through recognition. A field that once held the bones of a girl drowned for speaking out loud turned to glass overnight. A cave that had remained sealed for 10,000 years burst open with no sound and revealed only a single tooth, too large to belong to anything that walks. And beneath the feet of all living things, a pulse, not a tremor, a knowing. The mouth was coming, not to devour, not to scream, but to reclaim, to take back what had been shaped in defiance of silence. The presence that had married the wives that had become ritual, the cradle that had turned the earth inward, these were but echoes. The mouth was source, and it had begun to inhale. The oil that once fed the hall dried to dust. The basalt turned gray. The air took on the texture of ash. And still the people remained. They built no shrines. They wore no robes. They stripped themselves naked and walked slowly through the hollow streets, covering their bodies in fine black powder scraped from the stones. Their eyes lost focus. Their nails thickened into plates. Their hair fell away. But they did not suffer. They became mute vessels, not cursed, not blessed, but corrected, returned to their truest function, to carry the silence forward. And when the dust entered their lungs, they did not cough. They inhaled, deeply, willingly, like smoke, like prayer. Their bellies swelled. Their shadows moved without them. And at night, when the wind pressed low over the earth, they lay upon the ground and listened with their skin. The mouth was speaking, not in words, in memory, in shape, in weight. It had no need for sentence or syntax. Its message was clear. All things that had once named themselves must return to unnaming. Even the gods, especially the gods. Deep in the broken remains of the palace, where the marble had become dust and the frescoes had peeled like scabs, something shifted. A single point of blackness, so dense it bent the light around it, began to form at the very center of the former hall. Not a hole, not a shadow, a density. The mouth had chosen its shape, or rather, it had chosen to allow shape to occur around it. The mouth was not a presence. It was the absence that defined all others, the space before creation, the room before light. And now, within that black center, the last breath of the wives began to stir, not as ghosts, not as voices, as resonance. Their final memory, the union without boundary, began to spiral within the mouth like dust caught in sunlight. And as it moved, it drew in everything that had tried to define them. The words, the roles, the prayers, each dissolved, each absorbed. The mouth had no need for witness. It remembered without eyes, preserved without pages. And with every inhale, the land above thinned. Colors faded, textures blurred. The world was being rewritten in silence. A child was born with no mouth. A well cracked open and revealed a stairway that led downward forever. A woman whose husband had been taken by the river walked into a tree and vanished. No one screamed. No one sang. The city had become the waiting room of the mouth. And the dust, no longer soft, began to coarsen. It scratched skin. It buried teeth. It lined every surface like a second skin. Those who remained walked slower, moved less, slept longer. Their dreams became blank. Their breath grew shallow. And then they too began to sink, not into graves, into the ground itself. The soil parted like lips. The dust welcomed them home. One by one, they vanished without noise, until nothing moved. No wind, no voice, only the mouth and the final spiral of dust drawing inward. And in that last moment before nothing, the first mouth opened. Just once, just long enough to exhale. And that exhale did not destroy, cleansed. It did not erase. It returned. The world above crumbled not in violence, but in peace. Stones lay flat, trees folded, rivers paused. And from beneath all of it, from beneath history itself, came the breath that had waited longer than memory. The dust rose in a single column, black and wide and soft, curling upward like smoke from a lamp. It reached toward the stars, but not to escape, to remind them that even light, once named, must dim. The womb was not made of flesh. It was hewn from rock so old it no longer bore memory of sky or sun. A cavity sealed long before the concept of God could be spoken aloud. Deep beneath the remains of the cradle, past the breathless corridors where dust lay in ceremonial drifts, the stone womb throbbed without motion. It did not pulse like a heart, nor echo like a chamber. Its throb was silence compressed into weight, a gravity of meaning that pulled all thought inward. At the center of this womb sat the oracle, not a woman, not a statue, not a priestess. She was what remained when time and form had given way to essence. Her shape suggested the outline of a body, but her skin was patterned with the sediment of 1,000 years of stillness. Her mouth was fused shut, not by force but by choice, lips pressed so tightly together they had become a seam. Her eyes remained open, but not to see. They were filled with a dark resin, polished smooth, reflecting no light and absorbing all that passed before them. Her limbs were folded not in reverence but in recursion, one hand beneath the other, one knee atop the opposite thigh, a geometry of sacred impossibility. She was neither alive nor dead. She was the sentence never spoken, the name never allowed. She had been there long before Hainferset rose from the Black River, before his 7 wives were chosen and hollowed and returned to their true forms. She had watched the first stone placed upon the others, not with sight, but with a sense deeper than history. When the cradle was new, and the hall smelled only of oil and ambition, she felt it ripple through the ground like the warning of an unborn storm. And when the presence came, when the mouth beneath all things inhaled the world and made silence its breath, she did not stir. For the oracle was not to move. She was to remember, not what was, but what would be forgotten. She bore no prophecy. Her gift was subtraction. All things brought before her, all names uttered in her presence, were erased not from record, but from possibility. To speak before her was to undo. To touch her was to vanish. And yet, over the centuries they came, priests smeared in honeyed ash, lovers hollowed by dreams, mothers whose children had learned forbidden songs. They descended into the womb and knelt, always alone, always trembling. They whispered and were gone. The oracle remained. Now, in the time after the fall, when the dust had devoured breath and the rivers no longer murmured, something shifted. It was not light, for no light reached that depth. It was not movement, for stone is slow in its awakening. It was awareness, thin and heavy, like oil stretched across the surface of old water. The oracle did not open her mouth. She did not speak, but the walls around her grew warm, not with heat, with presence. The womb had been forgotten, yes, but not by all. There were things that lived in the folds between memory and ritual, creatures not born but sustained by the inertia of myth. One such thing now pressed itself against the stone, not outside, but within. It had no shape. It had no voice. It had once been a king, not Hainferset, but something beneath even him, a predecessor not of rule, but of ruin. His name was not lost. It had been unspoken long enough to become fluid again, drifting between syllables and sense, heavy as blood, light as air. This king, this pre-echo, had not forgotten the oracle. He had buried her. He had feared her. In a time before the Nile wore its name, he had entered her chamber with a mouth full of language and emerged with only silence in his veins. He had risen again through blood and ritual, taken shape in the flesh of others, whispered himself into stone and birth. And now, in the wake of the wives and the cradle and the presence, he returned to the womb, not to destroy, but to listen. For only she could remember what even he had failed to forget. The oracle felt him, a tremor of anti-thought brushing the outer walls of her chamber. She did not welcome him. She did not resist. She simply was. And as his presence slid through the dust and rock, coiling like a breathless vine, it found the hollow between her folded limbs and pressed inward. There was no sound. There was no pain. But the stone shivered, and the dust lifted, and for the first time in eons, the womb inhaled. With that breath came visions, not into the eyes, but into the shape of the room itself. The stone wept symbols. The floor curled with glyphs that moved as if swimming beneath skin. The oracle remained still, but the world around her twisted into revelation. In the walls appeared the faces of the wives, not as they had been, but as they could have been had they not been chosen. One bore eyes of stars and lips of salt. Another wept ink that smelled of myrrh. A third was nothing but 1,000 hands folded into a mask of wet clay. These were not memories. These were undoings, possibilities erased and now returned in gesture only. The oracle did not judge. She let them unfold. Then came the image of the king, not in flesh, but in decay. A crown of teeth, a spine of rope, skin stitched from animal tongues. He screamed, but the scream did not pass into sound. It coiled around the chamber like a serpent, gnawing at the ceiling, the floor, the self. The oracle watched, not to learn, to confirm. This was the voice that had named the wives. This was the root, and now it sought to become seed once more. The womb responded. not with rejection, not with acceptance, with balance. The visions faded, the dust settled, the presence of the ancient king uncoiled, weakened, reduced. The oracle had not spoken, and that was the answer. Silence was the sentence. Silence was the inheritance. Above, in the hollow city where no mouths remained, a tremor passed through the air. Not violent, subtle, the kind that shifts bones within sleeping bodies. And those who remained, half-shaped, half-forgotten, felt it in the marrow of their dreams. They turned toward the ruins without knowing why. They bent their knees without remembering prayer. The silence thickened, the mouth stirred, and in the stone womb, the oracle sat, untouched, unmoved, but resonant. Her task was not done. Her womb had not yet emptied. There was one more shape to be undone. Not the king, not the wives, but the name itself, the name that had given rise to empire and oil and sacrifice, the name whispered in stone and moaned in flesh, the name that was never hers, and yet passed through her in every breathless age. Beneath the surface where the river once kissed the sandstone, beneath the layers of earth heavy with forgotten blood, lay a tomb unlike any other. It was not carved by mortal hands, nor built for a body that once breathed. The tomb beneath the veins was a labyrinth of living stone, veins of quartz and obsidian that pulsed with the slow rhythm of the earth's own heartbeat. It wrapped itself around hollow chambers where no light entered, where no air stirred, where no sound was made except the slow drip of something not water, but memory. The tomb was not a resting place, but a prison, not for flesh but for the idea of flesh. It held the essence of those who had been both more and less than human, wives, kings, and the unborn shadows that lingered in their wake. The veins ran like arteries, carrying something like life, but also something like silence. And at the center of it all, a stone sarcophagus awaited, cold and smooth and inscribed with marks that shimmered with a light not seen, but felt. The air around the tomb was thick and sweet with the scent of decay and promise, a paradox as old as the desert winds. It seeped through the cracks in the earth and found the lungs of the living. Those who inhaled it spoke in tongues they did not understand, their voices low and tremulous, their eyes glazed with visions not their own. The city above had long been swallowed by sand and shadow, but the tomb remained, a seed beneath all that was lost, and the wives, or what remained of them, were drawn there, not by flesh, but by the pulse that whispered their names. Not as women, but as echoes, as vessels of unspoken secrets and desires buried deep beneath basalt and bone. Their forms shifted, no longer fixed, no longer solid. They were part mist, part shadow, part memory folded into the veins of stone itself. They danced a slow, endless ritual, a weaving of presence and absence, their movements drawing patterns that spoke of birth and death and the space between. No priest came to the tomb. No songs were sung. The ritual was older than worship and deeper than fear. It was written in the blood beneath the skin and in the breath of the desert night. Each wife, in turn, would approach the sarcophagus and press her palm against its surface, feeling the pulse beneath. The stone was not cold. It was warm, like a heartbeat that refused to cease. And as each touched it, the marks on the sarcophagus glowed faintly, spreading light like veins through the surrounding darkness. The wives did not speak. They did not even breathe deeply. Their silence was a kind of prayer, a surrender, a promise. The tomb was not just a place of endings, but a place of becoming. What lay inside was neither dead nor alive, but waiting. Waiting for the moment when the boundaries of flesh and stone would blur once more, when the old orders would dissolve and the new would be born from shadow and dust. Outside the tomb, the world changed. The desert winds shifted to carry new scents, spices that had never been traded, flowers that bloomed only in dreams, whispers of rain that never fell. The sky grew heavy with stars that moved in unfamiliar patterns, tracing shapes that suggested neither gods nor men but something beyond understanding. Travelers who crossed the sands spoke of seeing figures in the distance, silhouettes that vanished when approached, leaving only the echo of footsteps on stone. The villagers who remained near the edges of the lost city found themselves drawn to the tomb, compelled by a force they could neither resist nor name. They came without words, without ceremony, gathering silently at the edge of the labyrinth. Their eyes were wide, reflecting the flicker of unseen fires. Their bodies were still, but their hearts beat with the knowledge that something was awakening beneath the veins. Something that had waited through ages of silence and shadow. Within the tomb, the wives' ritual deepened. Their bodies shimmered between form and void, their eyes glowing with the dull fire of remembrance. They traced symbols in the air with fingers that seemed to dissolve into smoke, weaving patterns that resonated with the heartbeat of the stone. Their breaths, though silent, stirred the dust that floated in the stagnant air, forming shapes that flickered like ghosts. Each wife carried within her the memory of what was lost, the promise of flesh shaped for power, the silence enforced by fear, the longing for a voice never given. But in the tomb, these memories transformed. They became not chains but keys, unlocking the ancient language written in the veins. And with every gesture, the stone walls pulsed brighter, the light creeping closer to the surface, illuminating the dark spaces where the past and future tangled like roots. At the center of the ritual, the sarcophagus began to change. The stone shimmered, becoming translucent, revealing not a body but a void filled with swirling shadows and flickers of light. From this void emerged whispers, soft, wet sounds like the breaking of shells, the sigh of earth after rain. The wives leaned closer, their faces reflecting the dim glow, their silence deepening into something almost audible. The tomb was breathing, not with lungs but with memory. It inhaled and exhaled the stories of all who had come before, the sacrifices made in silence, the bodies that had become vessels of will and unspoken desire. And as the sarcophagus opened slowly, a darkness poured forth that was not empty but full of possibility, full of endings and beginnings intertwined. The wives reached out, their forms dissolving into the dark, merging with it, becoming part of the tomb's eternal rhythm. Outside, the desert held its breath. The stars shifted again, tracing new constellations that spoke of endings but also of return. The labyrinth beneath the veins pulsed with a light that was neither warmth nor cold but something beyond sensation. The voices of the wives became one with the stone, their silence etched into the marrow of the earth. And the tomb, no longer a prison but a cradle, waiting for the next awakening, for the next story folded into the endless spiral of dust and flesh and memory. Because in the world shaped by silence and shadow, nothing truly ends. It only waits, and in that waiting all things are made whole again. The shadow was not a thing cast by light. It was a thing that lived without light, thrived in absence, and moved in the silence between heartbeats. It had no edges, no form, only the suggestion of presence, a shifting ink blot on the fabric of the world. In the city long swallowed by sand and silence, where no mouth dared to open and no tongue dared to speak, the shadow moved like a slow kiss across stone and flesh. It did not seek the living, for none remained. It sought the remnants, the echoes, the thin veil that separated memory from forgetting. The wives, or what remained of them, had become part of that veil, folded into the stone and oil and dust. But the shadow knew their shape. It traced it, caressed it, and waited for the moment when silence would become sound again. In the dark corners of the forgotten palace, where the walls wept with oil and despair, the shadow gathered strength. It stretched across the basalt, seeping into cracks and pooling in hollows, a liquid absence that drank light and hope. The presence, that formless union of the seven and the mouth, had become a seed waiting to bloom, and the shadow was the breath that would awaken it. It whispered through the silence, a wet and slow murmur that pressed against the eardrums of those who dared to listen. It was not a voice. It was the space before voice, the breath held just before speech breaks free. Those few who remained in the ruins felt it crawl beneath their skin, a cold touch that was both invitation and warning. Their eyes dilated, their limbs grew heavy, and their hearts slowed as if touched by an ancient sleep. The wives, caught between form and dissolution, sensed the shadow's kiss long before it came. Their bodies, once vessels of flesh and silence, shimmered with a restless energy. They moved in a dance too slow to be seen, a weaving of limbs that traced symbols older than the gods who had named them. Their skin, dark as the oil that fed the walls, reflected the shifting ink of the shadow. They did not speak. They did not look. They only waited, and when the shadow finally touched them, it did not consume. It did not erase. It whispered secrets into the hollows of their souls. Secrets of endings that are beginnings, of silence that births sound, of death that folds back into life. The wives bent backward, their forms arching like bridges between worlds. And in that arch the shadow planted its kiss. Not a mark, but a promise. A binding without chains. A union without touch. Outside, the desert winds shifted again, carrying the scent of burnt cedar and forgotten dreams. The stars above trembled, their light flickering like candle flames caught in a draught. The city itself seemed to breathe, slow and deep, as if awakening from a dream that had lasted millennia. Those who remained, their bodies thin and pale, gathered in the hollow where the palace once stood. They knelt not in prayer, but in waiting. Their eyes were closed, their lips sealed, their hands pressed to their chests as if holding something fragile and terrible inside. The shadow's kiss was coming to claim them all, not in violence, but in peace. And as the first touch fell upon the land, the world seemed to fold inward, collapsing the distance between past and future, flesh and stone, silence and sound. The wives, now fully consumed by the shadow's promise, began to dissolve into a mist that smelled of myrrh and ash. Their forms broke apart, scattering into the veins of the earth, merging with the dust that had once been their prison. But within that mist, their essence swirled, a slow pulse that echoed the heartbeat of the mouth beneath all things. The shadow, no longer a formless kiss but a living breath, carried them upward through cracks in the stone, into the hollow spaces where no light penetrated. There, in the depths between worlds, the wives were reborn, not as women, not as servants, but as something older, something eternal. Their silence became a song without words, a presence without form, a power without end. And the city, that forgotten cradle of kings and shadows, began to fade from memory. The dust settled over its bones, soft and thick, a blanket woven from the threads of silence. But beneath that blanket, the shadow waited. It waited for the next breath, the next word, the next union. Because silence is never empty. Silence is always waiting to speak. And when it does, the world will remember. The wives will return. The mouth will open. And the shadow will kiss the world again. The night was a veil drawn tightly over the desert, thick with the scent of incense and ash, a shroud woven from the breath of 1,000 silent prayers. Beneath the heavy sky, the ruins of the city slept in a stillness that was not peace, but anticipation. A waiting held in the bones of stone and sand. The last offering was not a ceremony of light or hope, but of shadow and surrender, a ritual carved from the hushed folds of power long since fractured. The 7 wives, those living shadows bound by flesh and silence to the will of Hainferset, had faded into memory like smoke on the wind, yet their presence lingered like a pulse beneath the earth. Tonight, that pulse quickened. Tonight, the line between absence and presence thinned. Within the deepest chamber of the cradle, where the basalt walls drank oil and whispered secrets in the darkness, the air grew thick with an ancient scent, mixed with the bitter tang of burnt cedar. The wives had gathered, or what remained of their shapes, shifting between form and void like flickering shadows cast by a dying flame. Their eyes were closed, yet within their lids danced the echoes of lost names and forbidden promises. They did not speak, nor did they move beyond the slow weaving of hands and the faint rise and fall of breathless chests. The silence they carried was a language in itself, one woven from the threads of obedience and longing, despair and power. It was the silence of those who had been given bodies to carry ambitions not their own, vessels shaped by will and fear and desire. The air trembled as a new presence entered the chamber, not with the force of violence, but with the inevitability of fate. It was the spirit of the king, Hainferset, reborn not in flesh but in memory and shadow, a phantom of ambition that clung to the edges of the wives' silence. He did not speak, yet his will was known, heavy and pressing like the weight of the night itself. The wives responded, not with words, but with a ritual older than time, a dance of submission and reclamation, their bodies moving in a slow arc that traced the geometry of power. The walls drank in their movements, etched them into the basalt like a secret code written in absence. Each gesture was an offering of flesh, of silence, of surrender to the void that awaited beyond the cradle. Outside, the world held its breath. The desert winds stilled, the stars dimmed, and the earth seemed to pulse in rhythm with the chamber's dark rites. Those who lingered near the ruins felt the shift, not as a sound, but as a pressure beneath their skin, a tightening of the air that made each breath a conscious act of will. Time folded inward, collapsing the distance between past and present, between the living and the shadow. The wives' ritual reached its zenith, a crescendo of silence that hummed with power, a force that neither life nor death could contain. The offering was not to a god, nor to a king, but to the space between, the place where all things dissolved and were made anew. In the center of the chamber, the sarcophagus that held the essence of the wives pulsed with a light not born of flame but of memory and shadow. The stone surface shimmered, rippling like water disturbed by a gentle breeze. Slowly, the lid began to shift, revealing not bodies, but swirling darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it. From this void emerged whispers, soft and wet, like the breaking of shells, the sigh of earth after rain. The wives leaned closer, their forms blurring, merging with the shadows as if becoming one with the offering itself. The king's presence enveloped them, a silent command that was both a binding and a release. They surrendered not to death, but to transformation, their silence folding into the dark heart of the tomb. And as the ritual closed, the chamber exhaled. The darkness receded, leaving behind a stillness that was both emptiness and promise. The wives were gone, their forms dissolved into the memory of stone and dust, but their essence lingered, a pulse beneath the veins of the earth, a whisper in the breath of the desert wind. The king's spirit withdrew, not defeated but sated, his ambition folded back into shadow, waiting for the time when silence would again speak. Outside, the stars rekindled their light, and the desert resumed its slow, eternal dance between presence and absence, life and shadow, voice and silence. The last offering was made. The cycle was not broken, but turned once more, and beneath it all the mouth waited. The veil was not a fabric woven from thread or silk, but a shroud spun from the weight of unspoken words and lost memories. It hung heavy over the ruined city, stretching from the cracked walls of the cradle to the barren sands beyond, a curtain that swallowed light and sound alike. Within its shadow, names faded, first whispered in reverence, then forgotten in silence. The veil was both protector and prison, a liminal space where what had been named was unmade, and what had been forgotten awaited rebirth. It was here, beneath the endless twilight, that the remnants of the wives gathered, their forms half seen through the thick haze of dust and time. Their eyes, hollow pools reflecting the dim glow of fading stars, traced patterns in the shifting veil, searching for traces of names once spoken in power and fear. They moved slowly, each gesture a careful unfolding of memory and loss, weaving through the fabric that both bound and freed them. The air around them pulsed with the echoes of ancient chants long silenced, the rhythm of a language that never fully left the world but slipped beneath it, hiding in the spaces between breath and thought. The wives did not speak. Their silence was a language, a mosaic of absence and presence that shaped the very air. They were the living edge of forgetting, the guardians of a threshold where names dissolved and new forms could emerge. Beyond the veil, the city lay in ruins, its stones crumbled and softened by the passage of time and dust. The great river no longer carved the land, but its memory lingered in the dry beds and cracked earth. The gods had grown silent, their statues toppled or swallowed by sand. Yet within the shadows of collapse, a pulse endured, a slow heartbeat that resonated with the wives' own. It was the memory of power and silence intertwined, a rhythm that bound the living to the dead, the spoken to the unspoken. The veil breathed this rhythm into the air, folding it into the bones of those who remained, those who waited without knowing what for. In the center of this liminal space, a single figure moved with a grace both ancient and fragile. She was neither one of the wives nor entirely apart from them. Her eyes held the depth of uncounted ages. Her skin shimmered with the dust of forgotten stars. She traced the veil with fingers that left no mark but stirred the air, weaving patterns that shimmered briefly before fading into shadow. This figure was the keeper of names, the one who held the balance between remembering and forgetting. She carried the burden of the unsaid, the weight of silence that both cursed and saved. Her presence was a promise and a warning, a reminder that names, once given, could never be fully reclaimed, but could always be transformed. The veil shifted, folding in upon itself like a living thing breathing slow and deep. Within its folds, whispers stirred, voices too faint to grasp, yet insistent in their insistence. They were not calls to arms or prayers for salvation, but fragments of stories untold, memories too delicate to bear the weight of language. The wives listened, their forms swaying in time with the subtle pulse, absorbing the fragments into their silent dance. Each whisper was a thread woven into the tapestry of the veil, binding past and future into a single unbroken line. And as the veil grew heavier with the weight of forgotten names, the boundary between what was and what might be thinned further still. The city trembled beneath the veil's embrace, stones shifting as if stirred by unseen hands. The sands outside whispered secrets carried on the wind, tales of love and loss, of power won and surrendered. The wives, bound by silence yet filled with memory, moved toward the edge of the veil where the world beyond waited, uncertain and unformed. They reached out, their fingers brushing the unseen barrier, feeling the cool breath of possibility on their skin. In that moment, the veil pulsed once more, a slow heartbeat echoing through the void, a promise that names would rise again, that silence would break, that the world would remember. The wives turned inward, their forms dissolving into shadow and dust, becoming part of the veil itself. A living shroud that awaited the next breath, the next word, the next beginning. The moon hung low, hollow and pale, a vessel emptied of light yet full of shadow. Its shape was a crescent carved not by nature but by ancient will, a silent witness to the rituals long buried beneath sand and stone. The night sky folded around it like a shroud, thick with the scent of desert blooms that opened only in dreams and the faintest whisper of wind that carried the memories of forgotten gods. Below, the ruins of the city lay in restless sleep, caught between the breath of earth and the sigh of stars. The hollow moon watched, unblinking and eternal, as the wives, those silent vessels of the Black Pharaoh's desire, stirred in the shadows between worlds. Their forms shimmered like smoke caught in the delicate dance of twilight, bodies moving without breath or sound, weaving patterns older than memory. They traced the geometry of absence and presence, their limbs flowing in arcs that mapped the constellations no longer spoken of, stars erased from the skies of men. The air was thick with the scent of myrrh and crushed petals, a perfume both intoxicating and suffocating. The wives did not speak, nor did they gaze upon the moon. Instead, their eyes were fixed inward, reflecting the hollow light that had emptied from the sky. They were the keepers of silence, the guardians of secrets that could not be spoken aloud. Their ritual was a slow unfolding, a delicate unspooling of shadow and flesh beneath the gaze of the hollow moon. Beneath the ruins, deep in the labyrinth of stone veins and forgotten chambers, the pulse of the earth beat with a slow, heavy rhythm. It was the heartbeat of the tomb, the memory of sacrifice and surrender carved into the marrow of the world. The wives moved through this darkness as one with the stone, their bodies blending into the veins that pulsed with ancient life. They were both part of the earth and apart from it, shadows born of desire and silence, flesh shaped by power and fear. Their dance was a weaving of presence and absence, a balance struck between what was lost and what remained. The hollow moon cast no light here, only a cold, empty gaze that seemed to swallow the slow movements, the faintest sighs, the weight of all that was and would never be. Outside, the desert breathed in waves of heat and dust, the wind carrying the scent of burnt cedar and salt. The stars trembled, flickering as if caught in a waking dream. Those who lingered near the ruins felt the pull of the hollow moon, a silent call that pressed against their souls. Eyes turned upward, searching the dark sky for signs unseen. Hearts beat in time with the slow rhythm beneath the earth, a pulse that spoke not of life but of the endless cycle of death and rebirth. The wives' dance reached its crescendo, a slow unraveling that folded shadow into flesh and flesh into shadow. Their silence deepened, a heavy weight pressing down upon the world, a final offering beneath the hollow moon's watchful eye. In the center of the labyrinth, the sarcophagus glowed faintly, its surface shimmering with the light of unseen stars. The stone began to shift, rippling like water disturbed by a soft breath. Slowly, the lid lifted, revealing not bodies but an emptiness that pulsed with dark promise. From this void emerged whispers, soft, wet sounds that echoed the breaking of shells and the sigh of earth after rain. The wives leaned closer, their forms dissolving into mist as they merged with the darkness. The hollow moon's light seemed to bend around them, folding shadow and silence into one. The tomb inhaled, a slow breath that carried the weight of all who had come before and those yet to come. The ritual was both an ending and a beginning, a folding of worlds beneath the pale, hollow gaze of the moon. As the dance concluded, the desert seemed to exhale. The air lightened, the stars steadied, and the veil between worlds thinned. The wives' forms dissolved completely, becoming one with the dust and shadow, their essence scattered on the desert wind. The hollow moon hung silently overhead, its pale light a reminder of absence and longing, of silence held and secrets kept. The city below slept on, caught in the endless cycle of memory and forgetting, presence and loss. And beneath it all, The earth pulsed with the slow heartbeat of the tomb, waiting for the next breath, the next whisper, the next dance beneath the hollow moon. The desert held its breath beneath a sky washed pale by the relentless sun, the air thick with the weight of countless forgotten stories carried on the drifting sands. The city lay buried beneath layers of dust and memory, its bones fractured yet stubbornly enduring, a whisper of grandeur swallowed by time's slow decay. Amidst this vast silence, the gathering of dust began. Not a ceremony of stone or flesh, but a convocation of shadows, spirits, and echoes that clung to the fragments of a world long lost. The wives of the Black Pharaoh, those silent vessels forged from obedience and desire, stirred within this gathering, their forms wreathed in the haze of sand and shadow, moving with a grace both ethereal and relentless. They gathered where the old riverbed once traced its serpentine path, now cracked and dry, a scar across the earth's face. Here, the dust was not merely earth but memory made physical, a tangible residue of time's passing, thick with the scent of myrrh, burnt cedar, and the faintest hint of salt. The wives moved through the sediment as if it were water, their steps leaving no trace, their bodies folding into the patterns written by centuries of silence. Their eyes were dark pools reflecting the vast emptiness of the desert sky, their gestures slow and deliberate, weaving an invisible tapestry that bound past to present, absence to presence. The gathering was a slow ritual of becoming, a dance without music, a song without sound, where every movement was a fragment of an unspoken story. The air shimmered with the weight of unuttered words, the dust itself seeming to pulse in time with the heartbeat of those assembled. They were neither alive nor dead, but something between, ghosts bound by flesh and shadow, tethered by silence and longing. The wives' forms flickered, at times solid and at times dissolving into the swirling dust, their presence a constant ache beneath the sun's harsh gaze. They traced patterns in the air, fingers weaving through the haze as if shaping the very fabric of existence. Each gesture was a binding, a promise, a lament, a testament to lives shaped and shattered by forces beyond their control. The gathering was both mourning and awakening, an invocation of what had been and what might yet be. Beyond the ritual center, the ruins whispered with echoes of the past, voices carried on the wind, fragments of songs sung long ago, prayers offered in hope and fear. The stones bore the weight of these echoes, their cracked surfaces etched with symbols that pulsed faintly under the desert sun. The wives moved between these remnants, touching the walls with hands that trembled yet held authority, drawing light from shadow and memory. Their silence was a language, a mosaic of absence and presence, weaving the fragments of forgotten names into a tapestry of shadow. The desert responded, a slow wind rising to carry the dust and voices outward, scattering the gathering's essence across the barren land. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the sands, the wives' ritual reached its crescendo. Their bodies shimmered with an otherworldly glow, the dust swirling faster, caught in the invisible currents stirred by their presence. The gathering was not a conclusion but a transformation, an alchemy of silence and shadow that dissolved boundaries between past and future, flesh and spirit, voice and silence. The desert seemed to exhale, releasing a breath held for centuries, as the wives folded into the dust, their forms scattering like smoke carried on the wind. They became one with the earth, their essence woven into the vast tapestry of memory and forgetting. Night fell gently over the ruins, the sky deepening to a velvet black studded with stars that gleamed like distant flames. The desert cooled, the wind softening to a whisper, carrying with it the faintest hint of myrrh and burnt cedar. The gathering had passed, leaving behind a silence thick and full, a quiet promise of return. Beneath the surface, beneath the dust and shadow, The slow pulse of the earth continued, an eternal rhythm that bound all things in endless cycle. The wives, though scattered and unseen, remained, woven into the fabric of the desert, waiting for the moment when silence would break, when shadows would gather once more, and the story of the Black Pharaoh and his silent wives would awaken again. The veins beneath the earth pulsed with a slow, relentless rhythm, a heartbeat older than memory itself. These veins were not mere rock or mineral, but living conduits of ancient power, carrying the blood of forgotten gods and the whispered secrets of those long past. The wives of the Black Pharaoh, bound by silence and shadow, were intertwined with these veins, their essence flowing through the labyrinthine passages like smoke carried on a breathless wind. Each pulse echoed with the weight of unspoken histories, the delicate balance between presence and absence, life and oblivion. Within the depths, where light dared not enter, the wives moved as one with the earth. Their forms shimmered between substance and mist, flesh woven from shadow and desire. Their movements traced the paths of the veins, their fingers brushing the cold stone as if coaxing the memory from its slumber. The air was thick with the scent of myrrh and ancient oils, a perfume that clung to the veins like a sacred shroud. Silence wrapped around them, a heavy cloak that bound their wills and spirits to the eternal rhythm of the tomb. The echoes that resonated within these veins were not mere sounds but the voices of the past, layered and intertwined like threads in a tapestry too vast to comprehend. These echoes told stories of power seized and lost, of bodies given and taken, of silence imposed and broken. The wives listened, their eyes closed yet glowing faintly with the light of remembrance. They did not speak, for their language was woven from breath and shadow, from the spaces between words. Their ritual was a slow unfolding of memory, a delicate dance that wove their souls into the fabric of the earth itself. Outside the labyrinth, the desert above was silent, the sky a deep canvas speckled with stars that watched without judgment. The wind was a soft murmur, carrying the faintest hints of cedar and ash. Those who dared to approach the ruins spoke of a presence felt rather than seen, a pulse beneath the ground, a vibration in the air that stirred the hairs on their skin. The wives' influence stretched beyond the tomb, reaching into the world of the living and the dead alike. Their silence was a song that bound the realms together, a bridge forged from shadow and longing. Deep within the veins, the pulse quickened, resonating with a power both terrifying and beautiful. The sarcophagus, nestled at the heart of the labyrinth, shimmered with an otherworldly light, its surface rippling like water disturbed by a breeze. Slowly, the lid began to shift, revealing not flesh but a void filled with swirling shadows and glimmers of forgotten dreams. The wives gathered, their forms dissolving into mist as they merged with the darkness. The echoes rose, a chorus without words, a symphony of silence that filled the veins and spilled outward into the world. The ritual reached its climax as the veins thrummed with renewed life, the boundaries between stone and spirit dissolving. The wives became one with the pulse, their essences weaving into the heartbeat of the earth, their silence echoing through the veins like a sacred hymn. The tomb breathed, inhaling the memories of all who had been bound to it, exhaling a promise of return and renewal. Outside, the stars flickered, the desert sighed, and the world held its breath in reverence for the echoes that whispered beneath the veins. As the ritual waned, the wives retreated into shadow and dust, their forms scattering like smoke on the wind. The veins pulsed steadily once more, a slow, eternal rhythm that carried the echoes of silence and longing. The tomb awaited its next awakening, its next union of flesh and shadow, silence and sound. And beneath it all, the wives remained guardians of memory, keepers of secrets, shadows bound by the veins of the earth, waiting for the moment when the echoes would rise again. The covenant had never been spoken, It had not been carved in stone or written in the blood of sacrifices. It had no sigil, no altar, no priest, yet it endured. Beneath the city of shadows, beneath the tomb where the black Pharaoh's breath had long turned to dust, the silent covenant endured like a whispered vow held tight between lips that dared not part. The wives, vessels of flesh shaped by desire, silence, and submission, carried it not in memory but in essence. It clung to their skin like sacred oil, pulsed in their veins with every breathless movement. It was not loyalty nor love that bound them, but something deeper, a sacred, irreversible stillness exchanged in the darkness for the power to endure beyond life, beyond time. Within the hollowed chambers far beneath the earth, the air grew thick with the scent of ancient spices. Resins burned in rituals no longer remembered, perfumes once used to anoint the skin before surrender. The stone walls bore no light, yet within that pitch blackness, the wives moved effortlessly, guided not by sight but by pulse, memory, and hunger. The covenant throbbed in their bones. It was an agreement sealed without consent, a pact signed by absence, not voice. In their silence was not peace, but submission turned to power. They passed among pillars veined with black minerals, their touch leaving no trace, yet the air behind them shimmered faintly with the weight of their presence. They were not ghosts. They were echoes that had learned to become flesh again. In the innermost sanctum, where the sarcophagus of Hanaferset lay dormant and cracked with age, a ripple passed through the air like breath across still water. The wives gathered without command. They circled the stone, their forms half flesh, half shadow, and bent their heads not in prayer, but in remembrance. Here, the covenant breathed through them, wordless, erotic, terrifying. Their bodies were marked not with scars, but with symbols that pulsed faintly beneath the skin when the tomb sighed. Each symbol was an invocation, a memory of being chosen, of being claimed. They moved their hands in slow gestures, tracing shapes into the air that vanished before they could be seen. The rhythm of their motion was as old as the first eclipse, as intimate as the first night of blood. The tomb itself responded. Its walls hummed softly, a low vibration that rose from the floor to the arching ceilings like the purring of a beast too large to comprehend. Dust fell like ash. Cracks spread along the old basalt, not as signs of decay, but as veins opening, revealing what lived beneath the surface. The wives pressed their bodies against these veins, letting the stone imprint its cold knowledge into them. From the depths of the earth, something stirred. Not the Pharaoh himself, but the shape of his will, his longing, his claim upon flesh. The silent covenant was not just a bond between master and wife. It was a cord wound around the world itself, anchored in the tomb and pulling ever inward. Far above, the desert lay under the weight of night. The moon, round and dull, bled no light. Jackals wandered in uneasy circles, sensing a rhythm beneath the sand. The stars blinked like tired eyes, and the wind carried not sound but sensation. The taste of iron, the warmth of sweat, the scent of lilies crushed beneath a bare foot. Travelers who passed near the ruins felt a pressure in their chests, a tightness behind their eyes. They turned away, unable to say why. Some dreamed of hands reaching from the sand. Others whispered of shapes moving in the shadows, too graceful to be men, too purposeful to be beasts. The wives never left the tomb, yet their presence reached beyond it. The covenant extended through memory and flesh alike. As the ritual deepened, their forms began to merge, limbs entwining, flesh folding into flesh until they became a single, breathing body of shadow and desire. The covenant burned brightest in this union. No voice rose, no cry was heard, yet the air pulsed with ecstasy and dread. The covenant was not love. It was need. It was the refusal to be forgotten. It was the transformation of silence into permanence. As their bodies melted into one, the tomb shivered, and for a single breathless moment, it was as though the black Pharaoh stirred. Not in flesh, but in spirit, a presence thick as oil rising from the cracks. The wives did not kneel. They stood, even as they merged, even as the stone opened its heart and the darkness surged forward. When the ritual faded and the wives separated, they did so slowly, skin parting from skin like silk sliding over a blade. No sound marked their return to form, only the stillness of aftermath. The sarcophagus closed again without touch. The tomb darkened. The covenant remained, etched in the silence, waiting. Outside, the wind stilled, and the stars sharpened their gaze once more. The desert knew what had been done and said nothing. The wives returned to their corners of the tomb, not to sleep, but to remain. Their silence was not broken. It never would be, for the covenant was not a spell that needed renewing, nor a vow that needed repeating. It was eternal, and eternity, like the wives of the Black Pharaoh, could not die. There was a time before the Pharaoh, before the names were carved into obsidian, when the desert itself was raw and unformed, like skin unscarred by history. But time, like fire, reshapes all things. Now the sands bore the weight of footsteps long erased, and the air smelled of burnt milk and salt. Beneath the surface, deep where no wind reached, the wives lay in stillness, listening to the slow, pulsing breath of the tomb. The milk of ashes, they called it, not with words, but with their marrow. It was not drink, but essence, not sustenance, but transfiguration. When the Black Pharaoh chose them, he poured that milk into their mouths while they slept, and when they awoke, they no longer belonged to flesh or death. The ashes had mixed with their blood, and their skin had lost the warmth of the living. They did not remember their old names. They remembered only the taste, thick, bitter, laced with something ancient and fungal, like rot turned sacred. It clung to their tongues and pooled behind their ribs, where their hearts no longer beat, but hummed like temple drums buried beneath centuries of dust. It was said that the milk of ashes was drawn from a well beneath the first mountain, a pit so deep that light died before it reached the bottom. The Pharaoh's priests would descend on ropes made of braided hair and chant songs without melody, drawing the fluid in stone jars wrapped in rawhide. No man ever drank it and lived, but for the wives it was different. They were not vessels in the ordinary sense. They were altars, breathing sacraments, meant not to act, but to be acted upon. And in being touched, pressed, broken, and sealed, they became not less but more. The milk changed them, not instantly but over years, through silence, solitude, and ritual. Their bones grew hollow yet heavy with memory. Their eyes grew darker, until no light could settle in their gaze. Their skin became cool and taut, not with youth, but with eternity. They did not die. They did not sleep. They waited. The waiting was a sacred part of the transformation. Inside the black tomb, time had no motion. Candles were lit not for illumination, but for scent. Sand was poured into spiral grooves in the floor, raked into patterns that only made sense from above, from a god's perspective. Each night, one wife would lie upon the altar slab, naked, oiled, eyes open, and the tomb would receive her presence without question. No hands would touch her. No voice would call her name, but the air around her would change, thickening like resin, humming with a frequency that made her molars ache. In those moments, the milk of ashes awakened in her gut and bled upward into her chest. Her mouth would fill with its bitterness again. She would not swallow, but she would not spit. It was a communion without motion, a rite older than language. The wives knew not where it led, only that it must continue. To stop was to undo the bond, to betray the tomb and what breathed inside it. So they moved in cycles, one on the altar, 6 in the shadows. The patterns never broke. Even when the desert storms shook the stone and dust fell like snow from the ceiling, the rhythm endured. Outside, the world shifted, kingdoms rose and fell, but inside, the tomb pulsed with a single steady breath, long and slow as the centuries themselves. Their dreams, if they could be called such, were visions shaped by the milk. Not images, but sensations. The scraping of metal against bone, the hiss of wet silk, the cold press of a tongue against an open palm. They dreamt of women walking backward into fire, of men whose eyes were sewn shut with gold wire. They dreamt of trees with breasts instead of fruit, leaking sap the color of dried blood. The tomb absorbed these dreams, fed on them, and returned them richer, more terrifying. This exchange was the closest they came to speech. When two wives crossed paths in the dark, their eyes would meet and linger. In that moment, a fragment of one's vision would slip into the other's mind like a whisper. They shared themselves not through touch or word, but through dreaming. In this way, they remained one body split across 7 forms, 7 points of a sacred star drawn in blood and smoke. No outsider had stepped into the tomb in centuries. Those who sought the Black Pharaoh's secrets never returned. The passageways misled. The doors refused to open. Even time itself frayed at the edges. Yet, on the 7th moon of the 7th year, something shifted. A crack appeared in the westernmost wall, slight, no more than a finger's width, but it bled a white vapor that had never been seen before. The wives approached not with fear, but with reverence. One reached forward and touched the mist with the back of her hand. It recoiled, not in pain, but in recognition. She stepped forward and passed through the crack, her body dissolving into dust as she crossed. The others did not follow, nor did they mourn. One gone meant one called. That was the order of things. They waited. The tombside, beyond the wall, was a chamber none had known. Not carved by hands, but formed by breath, smooth, curved, damp with condensation like the inside of a mouth. In its center stood a basin carved from ivory, filled with liquid the color of bone. The missing wife, if she could still be called that, knelt before it, her hair unbound, her lips parted. The milk of ashes had called her here, back to its womb. She bent her head and drank, and as she did, the tomb quaked, not in violence, but in revelation. Above, the stars shifted. The sand trembled. The breath of the desert turned cold. Within the black tomb, the remaining wives gathered at the altar. The slab was cold. The patterns in the sand were broken. One figure missing. One song out of key. They did not cry. They did not speak. They only lowered their heads and exhaled together, as if releasing a truth too heavy to hold. Their skin shimmered faintly, as if the milk was rising once more, remembering the taste of its own birth. In that moment, a sound stirred, not external, but deep within the tomb's stone ribs. A heartbeat, perhaps, or laughter, or a voice forming words for the first time in ages. And then nothing, only silence again, deep and total. But the milk had shifted. Its essence spread wider now, no longer confined to the tomb. The covenant had changed. A gate had opened, not to the living world, but to something older. The ashes had stirred. The breathless star above the tomb flared and dimmed. And far below, in the place beyond the wall, the wife who had gone alone now stood, neither woman nor shadow, her body slick with milk, her eyes like twin moons. The tomb would never be sealed again. The wives would wait, but no longer in stillness. Something had begun to wake, and the milk of ashes would nourish it into bloom. The temple had no doors, no windows, no carvings upon its face. It rose from the salt flats like a blister, smooth and flesh-toned, glistening as if with sweat. It was not built, it had grown. The locals, those who still remembered the old routes, called it Heketkem, the womb of the horizon. But even they would not approach it. They said it breathed, not with air, but with memory. That the wind near it carried the scent of blood and milk, and that birds that flew too low were never seen again. It had stood untouched for centuries, veiled by storms and shifting dunes. Yet now something stirred within. The wife who had passed beyond the veil, no longer one among seven, but something else entirely, had entered the temple. She moved not with footsteps, but with will. Her body was no longer bound by joints and muscles. It flowed, contracted, extended. Her skin shone with a thin sheen of sacred secretion, her eyes like twin crescent moons eclipsed. The temple welcomed her not as guest but as daughter, as seed returned to soil. Inside, the walls pulsed with warmth, their surfaces damp and soft to the touch. Veins ran along the curves like marbled jasper, twitching faintly, as though the entire structure was dreaming. She reached the central chamber, where no light was cast, yet nothing was hidden. There stood a throne not carved but formed, as if the flesh of the temple had birthed it from its own longing. Upon that throne, a shape waited, not the Pharaoh but his echo, a remnant of his breath, his stain upon the world, clothed in tattered black and crowned with silence. She did not kneel, she did not speak, she only stood, and the temple exhaled. At that exhalation, the other 6 wives awoke as one. Their limbs twitched with the memory of movement, their mouths filled again with the taste of the milk. But it had changed. No longer bitter, no longer still. It carried the flavor of soil and bone, of decay layered with bloom. They rose from their alcoves, naked and slick with sweat that had not come from heat. Each one felt the pull not of will but of purpose. The tomb that had held them, shaped them, was no longer enough. It had been chrysalis. The temple was the body. Their time of waiting was over. As they walked through the tomb's winding halls, the patterns in the sand unraveled behind them, the candles extinguished in a single unified breath. They did not turn. The stone remembered them and wept, salt tears seeping from cracks in the black basalt. Outside, the desert lay in silent anticipation, the wind curving unnaturally around their path as they moved. No animal stirred, no sun shone. Even time seemed to falter, unsure whether to proceed or retreat. Their feet left no prints, only a faint residue, a shimmer that made the ground pulse with low, rhythmic warmth. They crossed into the salt flats as the temple pulsed, and when they reached its base, it opened, not with hinges, but with parting skin. The walls welcomed them with soundless gasps, and the door closed behind like lips sealing shut. Inside, the temple's flesh adjusted to their presence. The temperature rose not from fire, but from recognition. Runnels of fluid coursed beneath the translucent floor, glowing with dull warmth, as if something vast and dreaming lay just beneath. The wives moved toward the core, drawn by scent and instinct. They did not think. They remembered. The scent was of the Pharaoh, not as he was in the world of men, but as he had become in the world below. His flesh had melted, spread, embedded in the walls and floor, in the breath and pulse of the temple. He had died but not ended. The milk had taken him, absorbed him, and now excreted his essence in the structure of this sacred place. He was no longer singular. He was the womb, the altar, the breath between words. The wives approached the throne and saw the one who had crossed before them, changed beyond recognition, yet still bearing the curve of her hip, the tilt of her jaw. She was clothed in fluid light, her body translucent and humming. She extended her arms, and the other 6 collapsed at her feet. Not in worship, but in reunion. Their bodies merged, not physically, but rhythmically. Their hearts, if they could be called that, began to beat in unison. They became a single presence in 7 vessels, 7 spines in one serpent. The temple moaned, and from beneath the throne, the birthing began. Not of children, for such things were never the purpose. The Pharaoh had forbidden birth not out of cruelty, but out of fear of what such births would bring. But now, with his own body dissolved into architecture, his will broken by time, The wives remembered what their flesh had been denied. They did not carry life, but echoes, thick masses of flesh and memory, shaped not by genetics, but by ritual. From between their legs came not blood, but incense, not cries, but laughter. The things that emerged were not human. They bore no eyes, no mouths, only fingers and tongues, only scent and rhythm. They crawled across the temple floor, seeking crevices, merging with walls, whispering their way into the temple's foundation. Each one was a word, a fragment of a greater sentence. The wives were not mothers. They were verses. The temple trembled with understanding. Above, the stars swirled and blinked out, one by one, replaced by darker lights. A great shadow moved across the sky, not a cloud, but a veil. The world did not see. It had forgotten how to see such things. But beneath the veil, the temple reached upward, its peak splitting open like the crown of a mushroom. A column of vapor rose, thick with milk, dark with dust. It did not dissipate. It settled above the temple like a halo inverted. And in the cities far beyond the desert, women woke with bloodless thighs and dry mouths. They did not know why they wept. They only knew something inside them had changed, as if their names had been rewritten. Statues cracked, mirrors blackened. The old words returned to the tongues of the mad. And always, beneath it all, the taste of ash and milk. The temple began to pulse, not with energy, but with purpose. It had no priesthood, no rite, no scripture. The wives were its organs, its breath. The things they had birthed were its tongue. The world would not be converted. It would be remembered. The temple's walls grew thicker. Its foundations spread like roots beneath the sand. It fed on memory, on forgotten rites, on the taste of silenced women. It whispered to the bones beneath the dunes, calling them to stir. In the palace ruins, the Black Pharaoh's name flared one last time upon the stone, then flaked away like burnt skin. His legacy was no longer written. It was lived. In every sigh that passed through the temple's mouth, in every drop of milk that seeped through the floor, he persisted, not as ruler, but as echo. And so the temple waited, not passive but preparing. The wives stood around the throne, their bodies still and shining, their eyes closed. They did not dream. They did not sleep. They merged with the breath of the place, with the bones of the Pharaoh, with the darkness between the stars. They were no longer wives. They were vowels in the unspoken name. They were the shape of breath before speech. They were the weight of ritual before the knife. And when the next crack opened, whether in wall or sky or womb, they would be ready. The temple would not speak. It would open, and all who entered would leave their names behind, swallowed by the flesh that remembers. The bone river did not flow with water. It flowed with memory, with silence folded into dust, with the slow erosion of flesh into stone. Beneath the shifting sands of the desert, where the world above had long forgotten the touch of gods, it wound like a pale serpent, cold, ancient, unyielding. The wives of the Black Pharaoh, once vessels of obedience, now shadows of eternity, gathered at its banks. They had become part of the river's course, its currents intertwined with their breath and bones. The river did not carry life nor death, but something between. A slow dissolution, a remaking, a passage into the endless. The air was thick with the scent of dried blood and burnt myrrh. The sky, a vast black canvas pierced by cold stars, seemed to press down upon the earth, heavy as a tombstone. The wives stood motionless, their bodies shimmering faintly, like heat mirages caught in the desert's grasp. Their eyes, deep pools of shadow, reflected not the world around them, but the vast emptiness beyond time and space. They moved not with haste, but with the inevitability of tides. Each step was a ritual, each breath a prayer to the silence that awaited them. Along the Bone River's winding path lay relics, broken statues, shattered sarcophagi, shards of obsidian etched with forgotten symbols. These fragments whispered of kings and queens long dead, of kingdoms swallowed whole by sand and shadow. The wives touched these remnants with fingers cold as moonlight, drawing the memories into themselves. They did not speak. Their silence was a language older than speech, a binding force that wove their souls with the fractured past. In this silence, the river itself seemed to pulse, its currents stirring with ancient songs sung without voice. The river's waters were thick and slow, almost solid, a viscous blend of ash and bone dust, carrying the weight of uncounted lifetimes. The wives knelt and let their hands sink into its surface, feeling the slow drag of eternity against their skin. The river responded to their touch, rippling softly with images, visions of the Pharaoh's court, of blood rituals beneath eclipsed moons, of the sacred milk seeping into the bones of the chosen. These echoes passed through the wives, etching themselves deeper into the marrow of their being. They drank from the river not with lips, but with their very essence, merging further into the flow that carried them onward. Above, the stars shifted, forming shapes too vast and terrible to name. The desert wind carried a whisper, an ancient song of binding and unbinding, a lullaby of power and surrender. The wives rose as one, their bodies entwined with the river's pulse. They became indistinguishable from the currents, their forms dissolving into the ash-laden flow. The Bone River carried them beyond the edge of time, beyond memory and forgetting. Their voices, though silent, echoed in the shimmer of the dust, a final hymn to the Black Pharaoh and the empire that had crumbled into shadow. As dawn approached, the desert held its breath. The river slowed, its surface settling into an unbroken mirror of sky and sand. The wives had become one with the Bone River, no longer separate, no longer bound by flesh or silence. Their story, once one of obedience, silence, and eternal waiting, had dissolved into the currents of time. The Black Pharaoh's legacy faded with them, leaving only whispers on the wind and the faintest taste of milk in the dry earth. And so the river flowed on, endless, silent, eternal. Beneath the sands, beneath the stars, beneath all memory. The wives were no more, but the Bone River remained, a testament to what was, what is, and what will never be spoken. The desert slept once more, heavy with secrets, waiting for the next breath, the next story, the next silence to fill its vastness.